Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the AuxScout webinar, Paddlecraft Safety. My name is PJ O'Neill, and I'm the branch chief for STEM training in youth programs in the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Tonight for Paddlecraft Safety, we are very lucky to have the expertise of Dr. Robin Pope, PhD. He chairs the board of directors of the American Canoe Association as a division chief for U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary Paddlecraft Safety. And he's paddled countless of miles on lakes, rivers, bays, and the ocean, and I'm sure is part of many more organizations. But that's not the important part. The important part is that Robin is going to be sharing with us paddlecraft safety strategies and tips tonight. This webinar, the AuxScout webinar, is going to be recorded and posted to the AuxScout YouTube channel, where you can use it as a training tool with your flotilla or Sea Scout ship. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Robin Pope.
Thank you, PJ. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll share a PowerPoint presentation. And as PJ said, tonight we're going to be talking about paddling safety. And get through our technological hurdles. So in the presentation tonight, I'm going to first talk about why bother looking at paddling safety, why we think it's important. We're going to look at some data about paddling safety and use that to discuss broad principles regarding paddling accidents and how to prevent them. And then finally, we're going to look at a lot of specific actions that we can take to prevent paddling accidents, looking at a four-step model. First, trying to anticipate problems, using that anticipation to prevent them. When they do occur, despite our efforts to prevent them, look at how to manage them. And then after they've happened, ways we can look at perhaps mitigating the consequences of them. So why bother? In the United States in 2020, we believe that there were more than 20 million, probably closer to 24 million people who paddled canoes, kayaks, or stand-up paddleboards every year. And since about 2010, participation has grown in paddling by about 500,000 people per year. The reason it's growing is because paddling is an incredibly fun activity. There's no question that getting out on the water in a boat is a great thing to do, and getting in a boat that you're propelling, that you can get into shallow water where you're quiet and you can see the wildlife and do all sorts of fun things is a great way to get on the water. And if we look at the numbers, paddling is very safe. More than 20 million people per year do it, only about 125 fatalities for paddling each year. But most of those fatalities and most of the accidents associated with them are preventable. So why not take steps to prevent them and make paddling even more fun? And that's really going to be the focus of tonight's presentation. So to look at this, we want to start out first by understanding what kinds of serious accidents happen to paddlers. And not surprisingly, the most common thing that happens is an unexpected entry into the water, whether that's a capsize, falling overboard, unexpected entry into the water because of grounding. That is by far the most common problem we see. Much less common, but still important, are collisions, and often that's being run over. No matter how fast you are in a canoe or a kayak, you probably can't paddle fast enough to get seriously hurt. But if you run into a powerboat, or more likely they run into you, there's a totally different environment. And then the third third danger that we see are entrapments, which is an event occurs when the boat or the person is stuck on something and can't move. Those are much more common in moving water environments, but fortunately they're still very rare. So if we break those down, unexpected entry into the water, that's about 70% of all reported paddling accidents, perhaps more. And you can see here me and one of my scouts practicing what to do when that happens. We want to know how to get back in your boat or how to get to shore. And depending on the boat that you're in, the environment that you're in, you might choose to try one or both of those, but it's important to know what to do for yourself. It's also important to know how to help someone else. And it's best to know multiple ways, because if the only tool we've got is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And unfortunately, not every boating situation actually is a nail. So we want to know how to deal with multiple problems we might face. Collisions, well, paddlers are slow, small, and they're hard to see. And power boats traveling at speed don't have brakes. So if we don't anticipate this problem, then we might run into problems, might run into injuries. If we look at the paddler that's on the screen here, they're doing a couple things that are really good to help prevent the problem. And if we look at the next screen, look at collision avoidance. We can increase our visibility, decrease the likelihood of a collision in several ways. And the first is paddling in a group. Having a big group makes us easier to see. And unfortunately, the boater we just looked at isn't paddling in a group. Wearing easily seen colors does make us much easier to see. And he was wearing an orange life jacket in a reddish boat, which are both very easy to see colors. So they're doing a good job there. Light reflecting off paddles is surprisingly easy to see from a power boat. And the paddle that he was in was a wooden paddle with highly polished blades, and those reflect light very well. And they also serve as a nice contrasting color with the background. So even though the gentleman we looked at is not paddling in a group, he's taking a lot of steps to make himself safer, which is what we want. And then the third one we mentioned is an entrapment. And a strainer is a river feature that allows water to go through it, but does not allow you, your boat, or your gear to go through. And moving water can force us into debris piles, such as the one shown here, leading us to be entrapped or pinned in our boats. The challenge is that first, as land-based animals, when we see stuff to lean on, we tend to grab it. Unfortunately, on moving water, that's like grabbing something while you're on a conveyor belt or while you're on a bicycle riding next to a tree. The consequences can be unpleasant, because even gentle current can be surprisingly powerful. If we look at this picture, I'll try to get my cursor here, you can see a little blue feature down at the bottom of the strainer. That's a boat. And the two people up here looking down at their boat, wondering what to do next. Fortunately, they're out of the boat. They're not in significant harm's way, but their boat is still stuck under here, and they've got to figure out what to do about that. So if we know what types of accidents are common, we then want to think about the factors that contribute to paddling accidents. And the first one is lack of education, inexperience, and an inability to handle problems that come up. So we're going to talk a little bit about education in a few minutes, but a key element of that education is that you should wear your life jacket and stay away from alcohol while you're on a boat. Second factor is exposure to hazardous waters. And I chose this picture for a couple reasons. The boat that you see there is about 6 feet long. So that tells you that they're paddling on a pretty big wave. What may not be obvious is this person is performing some acrobatic tricks. They're deliberately there. They're not thinking that this water is hazardous, and at their skill level, they're probably right. For most of us, though, getting into a condition like that where we're in 6 or 7 foot breaking waves is a pretty hazardous condition, and we need to get some education and get some practice to understand what those conditions are and how to avoid them. And the third thing, navigation rule problems, either by the paddler or by an operator of another craft. What I'm showing here is a picture taken shortly after a ferry boat accident in New York Harbor. Paddlers ran into a ferry boat and had some significant injuries. So we want to make sure that we are paying attention to craft around us and not creating situations where we have collisions. So what are some actions that we can do? And there are lots of actions that we can take that are going to prevent us from having problems, that are going to keep us safer. And we all paddle to have fun. Nobody wants to go to the emergency room while you paddle. So safer paddling is more fun paddling. And the number one thing is to wear a life jacket. Most boating fatalities are drownings. Wearing a life jacket would help prevent most of those. The data shows that about 2/3 of boating deaths could be prevented by life jacket wear. Second thing is dress to swim. And the first part of dressing to swim is wearing your life jacket. But the second thing is recognizing that water's cold. Most of us know that if you were outside on dry land in 70-degree temperature, you'd feel pretty comfortable. That might be long pants and a t-shirt or shorts and a t-shirt. But 70-degree or colder water is considered cold water and really requires some type of insulation. The colder it gets, the more insulation that we need. If it's a 70-degree lake, we probably don't need the wetsuit that's shown here. But when it gets a lot colder than that, a wetsuit or a dry suit is critical. That's important right now. I live in Western North Carolina. It was about 85 degrees out today, but the rivers and the lakes have not warmed up. They're still in the upper 50s or low 60s. So it's easy to think that the air is warm, so the water is warm, and that's not always a good assumption. So we want to make sure that we stay safe by dressing to swim. Part of that dressing is also carrying survival and signaling equipment on you. If it's in the boat and you swim out of the boat, you may not have access to it. So make sure that you're carrying the minimum gear that you need with you. And then a third part of this is what happens when we get to shore. If we're barefoot while we paddle, and we have to move on shore, we have to run for help or hike out for help, it's nice to have some shoes on. So we think about shoes as armor for your feet. It's a way to help you be more engaged in somebody else's rescue and help make sure that you can rescue yourself if necessary. So dress to swim by dressing appropriately, wear your life jacket, carry gear with you, and think about protecting your feet. You're going to see a recurring theme as I speak here. It's get some education. Make sure you take some classes, and after you've taken the classes, go out and practice and get some more education. Learn what to do when you enter the water. And what I do on a stand-up paddleboard is different than what I might do on a kayak, certainly different than what I would do on a powerboat. If I'm using all three types of those craft, it's my responsibility. If I'm a Sea Scout skipper or a scout leader or a flotilla member, it's my responsibility to make sure the people that I'm training know how to do that. Another big part is avoiding debris that's in the water, and education is certainly going to talk about abstaining from alcohol while boating. That shouldn't be an issue for auxiliary members or for scouts, but we need to remember that there are other people out there, and if we can see that they're creating hazards, we can deal with that hazard best by staying away from it. There is a lot of free instructional material that's out there. The links that I've put on here are several opportunities for you. Paddling.com has a series of 8 paddling safety videos. Each one is about 5 minutes long, provides some really solid information on how to paddle safely, what to do with problems. The American Canoe Association has a large video library, and a link to that library is presented here. We have about 40 videos that cover everything from how to choose a life jacket to what to do if you swim out of your boat, to how to go kayak fishing, how to plan larger trips. So both of these are great video resources. The American Canoe Association also just released a free online course that covers some basic safety information and can help trip leaders, help scouts determine the skills that they need to develop and give them the basic information so they can get on the water safely for the first time. There are a lot of other actions we can take, and boating in a group is a big one. We can see a group here on a river. This is a number of people from my Sea Scout ship, and we want to stay together because we have more fun when we're together, but also so that if somebody does get in trouble, we've got some resources around. At the same time, part of that planning is to make sure that one person in our group at least is not on the water with us. They're at home, and they're who we file a float plan with. That float plan, which we'll talk more about in a bit, gives some details about where we're going, what to do if we get in trouble, and how to know if we are in trouble. When is the trip supposed to be done, and what should happen if we don't call in on time. Part of that group is also making sure that we can communicate effectively. So we want to make sure we have effective communication equipment. And that might be something as simple as a whistle. It might be a cell phone or a VHF radio. Again, what you choose to use is going to be dependent on where you're boating, but you do want to make sure that you've got appropriate communication equipment. You want to make sure that it works in the area that you're boating, and you want to make sure that you've got some backups. We mentioned navigation rules as a reason to have problems while you're boating. It's important to know those rules, but we can really simplify them for paddling issues because there are a lot of rules about lights that don't impact paddlers. I don't have a battery or an engine in my boat, so I can't power those. But there are a few simple things that we can do. The first one is to recognize that paddlers are slow, small, and hard to see. So instead of trying to claim right of way, we should assume that other boaters just don't see us. And if we assume that the boat doesn't see us, we can take steps to stay out of their way. Part of staying out of their way is avoiding channels where bigger and faster boats might be. Channels might be where you have a large deep draft vessel that can't go anywhere else. So if you force them out of the channel, they might run aground and injure themselves. So they may be unwilling to do that. Larger vessels may have trouble seeing you. They may assume that they're in the channel safely, so you shouldn't be there. If we're going to be around channels, we want to stay in a group. We want to cross at a narrow spot at right angles of the channel, and we always want to keep a sharp lookout, because often paddlers will have right of way, but that doesn't help us much if we get run over. One of the unwritten rules for navigation is called the rule of gross tonnage, which is a long polysyllabic way of saying that if I'm bigger than you and I run into you, you're going to get squished. So we want to not get squished. Look out for other boats. One way to help make sure we can look out for other boats is to know where they're likely to be. And the way to do that is to know where we are. We want to know where we're going. We've got charts and maps and guidebooks and local knowledge from outfitters and liveries that can tell us where to go. Part of that will tell us where we can go to have fun, but part of it will also tell us what are the local hazards. The hazards that you might see on this chart from the coast of North Carolina are very different than you might see for Western North Carolina in the mountains. The way to find them, though, is to use the resources to look for them. Once we identify the hazards, we can make some plans to avoid or mitigate them. So avoiding them might mean I choose to paddle on a different river or a different waterway. Mitigating them might be to recognize the hazard and plan to walk around it. Walking around a waterfall or some such feature that could be a problem for us. It might be choosing a time to cross a channel when the tide is still, when it's at high tide or low tide, so there's not much tidal current. The only way to identify those is to look for them in advance. Charts and maps will also help us identify emergency access points. If you have a long trip planned, you might want to schedule places where I know I can get off the water safely if necessary. Without doing that planning in advance, you might not know which side of the river has roads closer to it. You might not know where the closest hospital is. You might not know how to get to safety or back to your car. So using your maps and charts to identify those emergency access points and develop a safety plan will make you safer and help you have more fun. I mentioned education earlier, and part of education is practice. Go out and learn what you learn, put it into practice, and then recognize that we want to come back and get more training. And part of that training is going to be assessing the hazards and being flexible. So let's look at a few hazards that we want to be able to deal with. First hazard that we want to plan around are the weather conditions. And we know that strong winds, lightning, hail, cold water, cold air can all make our trips miserable. I chose this picture because you can see some lightning in the background, and that's just a good reminder that the only safe place from lightning is someplace else. If we're out on the water, we probably want to get off the water when we're dealing with lightning. So that means being aware of weather forecast and taking steps to deal with them when we see that weather is not what we're looking for. We also want to remember that even in appearingly mild conditions, wind can blow us offshore pretty fast. And offshore is where we want to avoid being. We want to make sure that we're close to shore, close enough that we can rescue ourselves and others if we get in trouble. Water conditions. This is a big, gnarly rapid. You can see the small boater amidst the large waterfall and waves. Pretty clearly, that's a hazardous condition. But there might be conditions that are less obvious. Just tidal currents, debris in the water, waterfalls, all can be hazards that we want to assess and make sure that we know how to deal with them. Because we can unintentionally get into a situation very quickly if we're not paying attention and if we haven't planned well. Other people. We mentioned that we are slow, small, and hard to see. Well, power boats are big and fast and noisy and easy to see, but the people in this power boat might not see us at all. So we've got to assume that they don't see us, that they may not have the skills to avoid us. We've got to take steps to get away. A hazard we often don't think about is ourselves. Our judgment is critical, and it's easy to have good judgment when the conditions are nice. the day before the trip. The weather is great. We're well fed. We're rested. But if we don't take care of ourselves during the trip, our judgment goes away. And that's why I have a picture of a water bottle here. Remind us to eat and drink, to take care of our bodies while we're on the water. Make sure that we're avoiding sun and making sure we're using our sunblock so that we stay healthy and comfortable while we're out there. All of this comes into the idea of planning your trip. And the Coast Guard has a float plan app, and we've got a link to that later in the presentation. As we look at how we do our planning, it's not just what goes into the float plan before. We think about 3 time frames. One is long before the problem, then before the problem, and then just before the problem. And each one of those has some critical steps that we can use to prevent the problem. The first one is long before a problem happens, and that could be days to decades. At this point, you don't know where the problem is going to happen. You don't know what the problem is going to be. You don't know when it's going to be. You don't know who's going to be around. So the way that we prevent issues here is all about personal preparation. Develop your personal skills. And what skills should you learn? Well, pretty much everything. I'll up everything, including your rescue and your first aid skills, your boating skills, your knowledge, your familiarity with the areas that you're going. An important thing to remember in paddling is that it's a physical activity. So developing your strength and endurance, just hardening yourself to longer trips will help prevent problems here. If you've done a good job here, you then move to the before stage, which we can define as minutes to months. In this stage, you've decided where you're going and when you're going, and you have an idea of who you're going with. So trip planning is about developing site and group specific knowledge. That site-specific preparation includes looking at your charts and guidebooks and maps so you know the area, learning your access points, and making sure that there aren't any access restrictions or regulations that you need to be aware of, and particularly checking to make sure that you don't need any permits. If you do need those permits, this is the time to get them. We want to check anticipated conditions. There's a saying that climate's what we expect, weather's what we get. This is the time to check the climate. If I'm planning to paddle on the North Carolina coast in September, I know that the weather is probably going to be pretty good. I also know that there's a chance there might be a hurricane. So I need to incorporate that into my planning and site development. I also want to make sure that if I'm looking at a specific trip, that I start thinking about the skills and abilities that are needed for it. A 1 hour paddle on a lake has a totally different skill and physical ability set than a 10-day paddle in a large sound or across a bay or lake. So we make sure here that we've got those skills before we get on the water. That group-specific preparation, after we've looked at the site-specific, we think about the people that we're paddling with. Look at our abilities, look at how we're feeling, and remember that our abilities are going to be impacted by your health and situations on the day of the event. Think about our students, our scouts. If it's a week before finals and all you've been doing is worrying about school and studying and not doing anything on the water, it's probably not a good time to do something that's really challenging. A better time to do challenging things might be if you've been able to paddle all summer, you've been able to develop your skills, and now everything is sharp, you're physically and mentally prepared, and you can do harder trips. We want to make sure that our equipment is all in good working order. And this is the time to do a gear check and make sure that everything works. And if it doesn't, to repair or replace it. We also want to think about practicing working together. Teamwork is critical for paddling. And even though it's often an individual sport, there are 1 or 2 people in a boat and we're all the captain of our own vessel, but it is also very much a team sport. We're very much dependent on each other, and we want to make sure that we're there for each other. And a way to do that is to practice paddling together before we do any type of big trip. We mentioned some equipment, and there's a lot of safety equipment that you could bring with you. I've got a picture of some of it here. If we go from left to right, the gray and red bag is my first aid kit, which also contains some survival gear and boat repair gear. You can see that's a fairly big bag, but you choose the bag based on what you know how to do and where you're going. Doesn't make sense to include things that you don't know how to use. So get a bag that contains the first aid equipment you need. Think about some survival gear. What happens if you have to spend the night overnight in the area that you're at? So a small tarp or a bivy bag or even a couple of large trash bags might be enough to make sure that you get through the night. The next thing there, it says NRS, the big orange block, is a paddle float, which is a rescue tool that can help us get back in our boat if we capsize or swim. And next to that, if we capsize or swim, we might have to empty the boat. So I've got a pump. There are other dewatering devices. You might have a bailing bucket or a sponge, but we want to think about some way to get water out of our boat. Generally, we paddle during the day, but the next item there that looks like a T with a black line crossed by an orange light is a light. And we know that if we're paddling at night, we have to have some type of bright white light that we can deploy in time to prevent collision. If you're going to paddle at night, make sure you bring that. Another critical piece of safety advice is the small yellow block down there, and that's a whistle. In my opinion, every life jacket should have a whistle on it. If I swim out of my boat, I want to have a signaling device with me, and a whistle is a lot easier to use than me yelling. Another good signaling device is the radio that's next to that. And it might be a radio, it might be a cell phone, but we want to think about some type of communication device, and multiple communication devices are best. And then the final thing, the yellow bag on the right, is a throw bag, just a rescue line that we can use for towing, that we can use to extend our reach to someone that's in the water. Rescue lines are a valuable piece of rescue equipment that most people should have, and that ultimately every paddler should learn how to use. So if we've done all of this, we've developed our personal skills, we've tried to learn as much as we can about the group that we're with and the site that we're going, we finally made it to the water, and now we're at the just before stage of an accident. This is when we recognize a hazard and avoid the hazard. Some key things here in avoidance are making sure that people do know where we're going and will come looking for us if we get into trouble. I said weather is what we get, climate's what we expect. Just before is when we look at the weather. We look at the weather forecast, we look at the weather conditions that we're actually dealing with, we look at the water conditions that we're dealing with. And instead of dealing with what we predict, we deal with what we actually see. We think about, have any hazards developed overnight? And that might be boat traffic or debris or a global pandemic. How are we going to handle the situation that we're dealt with? And then we make some decisions. Should we continue with the planned trip or modify our plans? This can happen while we're deciding to get on the water. It can happen while we're on the water as we move downstream and deal with problems. It can happen as we come up to a feature on the water and have to decide, do I paddle right? Do I paddle left? Do I get to shore, or do I try to drive through it? It's all about recognizing and knowing how to respond to it. A great example of using this just before approach comes from a paddling story that I read in a canoe club journal. And it was an article about a trip that a group of club members had taken. They all went out, they had their skills together, they knew where they were going, they used the long before and the before stages to prepare. They got to the water, and it had been a rainy day, and the river they were going to paddle was a lot higher than they expected, but they decided that they had the skills to deal with it. They got on the water and very quickly found out they were wrong. Several people swam quickly. There were boats and paddles and people going everywhere. But fortunately, because they had prepared in advance, they were able to get everybody rescued, get everybody to shore, and reassess. And when they did that, they looked upstream, realized they could still see the cars where they'd put on, and their decision was to carry back up to the cars, go home, watch movies, and drink hot chocolate. That was, to my mind, was one of the best stories I've ever read, because it talks about the idea of recognizing you've gotten in over your head, and instead of trying to continue, trying to run the risk of making things worse, you respond to it and take some appropriate steps so you can still have fun. And that's important because we want to be humble when we find a potential problem. The water is going to be there tomorrow. We want to make sure that we're there to enjoy it. Being humble, being willing to say, today is just not the day, or being able to say, that hazard downstream, I need to walk around it or paddle around it or do something to not deal with it, is the way to go. So if we look at all of this and think about how we're going to plan a trip, there are a lot of things that we can go through on a checklist. And the first is, where and when are you going to boat? That when is important because it talks about the venue we're paddling, but where is also important. Where is important because it's the venue. When is about the weather you're going to deal with. The local river that I paddle most frequently is a very different river in January than in June. And so I've got to look at both of those. We want to write down who's going with us and what are the likely weather and water conditions, and then prepare for them. Those weather and water conditions are part of the hazards, and there are a lot of others that we can deal with. Once we have that information, we can start thinking about, do we have the skills and equipment to do that trip safely? And if not, what do we need to do to develop them? The day of the trip or the day before, we're going to file a float plan, and we'll mention on the next slide what should be in that. We're going to check all of our equipment, review all the conditions, make sure we have a plan for dealing with it. And then just before we get on the water, we're going to be flexible. If the conditions change, we're going to change what we're going to do. When we actually file a float plan, that's a description of what we're planning to do, aimed at the idea of what happens if there's a problem. How do we make sure that somebody will come get us? So that float plan should include a lot of information. For paddlers, we want to know how many people are in our group, and ideally, what are their names and how do we contact them and their emergency contact. We'd like to know the number, type, and description of the vessels that are going with us. And we want to know the number of vehicles that are involved. And ideally, it'd be great to have license plate and description of the car so that law enforcement or first responders can go to the access points and say, yes, that vehicle is there, or no, it's not. If they just see a vehicle and don't know if it's part of our group, it's not as helpful. We want to make sure we write down the waterway that's being used, including the put in and take out locations where we get on the water and come out, and how long we expect that trip to take. We want to know not only how long we expect it to take, but once we add in a little bit of buffer, when are we overdue? And what should somebody do if we are overdue? And then one of the most important things is, once you get on the water, you have a great trip and everything has gone well, make sure you let the person that's holding your float plan, that person that's ashore and responsible for activating first responders if there's a problem, make sure that you let them know that the trip is done and occurred successfully. It'd be embarrassing to have a great trip followed by EMS showing up trying to find you because you forgot to call the float plan holder. The link that's on the bottom of this slide is an example of a float plan that's produced by the Coast Guard Auxiliary. You can also do a Google search on float plans, and all sorts of organizations have these. They're a great thing to use. You can use them as a template. You can fill them out and just make sure that you do use them and share them with somebody on shore. So to wrap up, some take-home messages I'd like you to have. First, paddling is fun. I love paddling. Some of the best experiences I've had, both personally and with my family, are on the water while we're paddling. And one reason it's fun is that it's generally very safe, but we can take more steps to make it even more fun and more safe. The first of those is plan to swim. As paddlers, we are all boaters, but we're also swimmers periodically. We have to expect that we're going to get in the water, so we need to dress to do that. And the first part of that is always wearing your life jacket, not just in the boat, but anytime you might be getting in the boat, anytime there's a risk that you might be boating and potentially in the water. We always want to anticipate and prevent problems. Wearing that life jacket is one of the first steps in that. Learn to identify the hazards in the area that we're boating and know how to deal with them. Think about boating in a group, keeping a sharp lookout and taking steps to avoid collisions. And recognize that if our skills aren't adequate for the conditions right now, we can modify the plan. We can always develop new skills. We can always come back to the water later, as long as we've taken the steps to be there safely. And I will be happy to answer any questions.
All right, so if you do have any questions, you can post them in the chat and we'll relay them to Robin to get your questions answered. I want to say thank you for a fantastic presentation. And I'll say something that was reframed for me tonight, the way you put planning into perspective when addressing potential problems as long before and just before, I think is really, really helpful. And not only creating your plan for the day, but really to develop all those skills that you're going to need throughout your paddling career. That was an amazing piece of advice.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question here from Richard. Do you use spot devices?
I do not use spot devices personally for my paddling. I'm primarily a whitewater paddler, and spot devices aren't, particularly for what I do, not very helpful. However, when I'm doing sea kayaking and I'm in a more exposed condition, I do use a personal locator beacon, and I strongly encourage people to do that.
Great. A question that crossed my mind during the presentation, say you're going out with a group, and say it could be your Sea Scout ship, and you have paddlers of different skill and experience. Is there kind of a best way to group paddlers? For example, the strongest paddler, is there a buddy system? Is there a certain order that you want to try to keep paddlers in together during your trip?
There is, and I think of it similar to the way we would do a hiking trip. The person that is slowest sets the pace. One of the things we know is that your maximum theoretical speed is a function of your hull length. So if I'm in my sea kayak, I am much faster than if I'm on my 6-foot whitewater kayak. It doesn't make any sense to put the person in a sea kayak out in front because we'll never see them. So we put the slowest person in front. We like to think about having the person in front of the group be pretty experienced. We want them to be out in front, identifying any hazards and doing some group management when they see them. It's nice to have buddies. Sometimes, depending on the venue, a buddy system doesn't work as well. So in open water, a buddy system works great. In whitewater settings, we end up more in pods of 3 or 4 than in a true buddy setting. But buddies, that either buddy or pod works well. And we like to keep the least experienced or least skilled boaters in the middle of the pod. So I'd have a skilled boater in front, a skilled boater in the back as a lead and a sweep boater, and then keep my less skilled people in the middle, so that if there is a problem, I'm always going to have somebody that can respond to them.
Great. Yeah. So we have a question from Don. It's one that I wonder too. Do you feel sit on top kayaks are less safe?
Safe is an interesting idea. I think sit on top kayaks are different. So I think that the advantage to a sit on top kayak is that you don't have to worry about that sensation of being trapped in your vessel. If you fall off, then you just climb back on. The disadvantage is that because of the structure of them, your center of gravity is a little bit higher and they might be a little bit tippier. They balance that out by often being wider, so the wider beam helps make them more stable. I think it depends on the vessel that you're dealing with. So for example, I've got several sit on top kayaks that are designed for whitewater. They've got whitewater rigging and outfitting, thigh straps to keep your knees locked in, a back band, braces so that you can put your feet on them. I haven't tried to roll one just because they're so beamy, but they're secure enough that under the right conditions, I probably could roll it. I think that's a very safe boat. It's purpose built to be a whitewater sit on top. There are similar sea kayaking and surf kayak vessels that are purpose built for that. I think where we get in trouble are the vessels that are less expensive, not necessarily purpose built, and maybe not as well put together. You can imagine that we can buy a car, and if you ask is a car safe, it's hard to answer that. If I go down to Walmart and buy a Matchbox car and try to use that to go to work, that's not safe. If I go down to the dealership and I buy the top end vehicle with all the safety features, that is safe, even though they might be similar. So that's a complicated answer to a simple question. But I guess the short answer is maybe.
All right.
Don, does that help? Okay.
Don says yes.
Okay, great.
All right. So the next question is an opinion on communications here.
Mhm.
So from Richard, when you're all strung out along a stream, do you use ham or marine radios in front and back to control the group, or what type of radio do you use or recommend?
Yeah. So on a river, it's pretty uncommon to use a radio. Often even with line of sight radios, the signal is just not great because of the bends in the river. We generally depend on visual contact. However, in longer trips, then we often will either use a VHF radio or a Motorola type walkie-talkie. You can get some waterproof ones that work well. But generally it's line of sight communication.
Okay.
And then I see that the other question about flat or round bottom. So again, that's a maybe, and it all depends. The advantage of a rounder bottom kayak, what we would call a displacement hull, is that its performance is generally a little more predictable. A flat bottom boat we describe it as planing, and that's not exactly correct, but it has some performance differences, and the edges that are involved with a flatter bottom, sharper chined boat make it sometimes less predictable. So I think that if we're in a venue where scouts are supposed to be, then it often doesn't matter. But if I'm going to be looking at something that I'm going to be in for a long time, paddling a longer distance, I generally am going to be in more of a displacement or rounded hull boat. If you had asked me this question 10 years ago, I probably would have had a different answer, and I'm not sure what it would have been. But the paddling community does kind of bounce back and forth between preferring more of a planing or flat bottom hull versus a displacement or rounded bottom hull. And then it also depends on whether you're talking with primarily sea kayakers or whitewater boaters or kayak anglers. So again, it's a somewhat, it depends. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Our next question, if someone needs help, do you use STRG?
So speak, throw, row, go. That is a mnemonic that's used in lifeguarding, and we do teach that. If we think about what we're doing here, speaking is the first thing that I want to do. If I can tell someone to swim to me or paddle to me without ever getting in the water, that's the best thing I can do. Throwing something to them using a throw rope is a powerful tool. You need to have a good anchor point to do that. So that's more of a shore-based rescue. Rowing, we think about a boat that we can actually rescue somebody from. So more of a rowboat, sometimes a canoe. And then going, from a lifeguard perspective, we often think of it as a swimming rescue. But I would argue that a kayak is very much a go rescue. It doesn't take a whole lot of skill or a whole lot of strength for a swimmer in the water to make me go in the water from my kayak. Just a little bit of pressure and I'm going to be swimming too. We can add some things into here. And so we do use the reach, throw, row, go. We also use the idea of rescues being simple, safe, and speedy. So ideally, we get all three of those. The rescue is as simple as possible. It's as safe to the rescuer and ideally the victim as possible. And it is as speedy as possible, because speed is often safety. If you're in a little bit of trouble and I get you to shore right now, then I don't have to worry about problems later on. If I can get all three of these, that's great. If I can get 2 out of 3, I'm pretty happy. If I only get 0 or 1 out of 3, that's an indication that I should reassess what's going on. And I might be in a situation where a rescue is not safe to me or the victim. It's very slow and it's very complicated. I'm only going to be there if I've done a lot of other things first. So definitely not my first choice. The final thing is looking at it from a could I, should I perspective. Can I do something? So if somebody is in trouble, my options might be to wade out to them. It might be to swim out to them. It might be to call a helicopter. It might be to tell them to swim downstream until they get to a pool. I've got lots of options. I then need to look at should I. So I might think about an option where I swim out to somebody, but if there's a big waterfall downstream, swimming out to them puts me at risk, and I need to reconsider that. I need to essentially look at my personal capabilities that are involved, the responsibilities to the group, and then what I can do about that. Unfortunately, there's not a simple answer about the best rescue tool. And I'll be happy to go on for hours about that.
Sure. So our next question is one of value and investment, right? Do you think a $200 kayak is a better long-term value for a ship, or a $600 or more plus kayak? So what are we looking for, I guess, in terms of value specifically for a Sea Scout ship?
I think we're looking for long-term value. And if we look at the vessels that I've purchased for my ship, they're all in the 600 to 1,000 plus range. The less expensive boats that you might buy at a big box store aren't made as well. They aren't designed for long-term use. My experience with Scouts is similar to my experience with rental customers. If you don't personally own the boat, you don't necessarily take as good a care of it as other people might. If you're a Scout and you've never, this is your first time dealing with the boat, you might drag it, you might drop it, you might stand on it. And you only have to do that once to potentially damage a less expensive vessel, whereas a higher quality vessel is more likely to survive that. The other thing is that in many of the more expensive boats, part of that expense is the outfitting, the stuff that's in there to make it more comfortable. So a less expensive vessel that doesn't have any adjustments to make it more comfortable for a Scout to sit in means that the Scout is less interested in sitting in it. If we take a more expensive boat with much higher quality outfitting, it's like putting on a pair of well-worn jeans that just fits in really comfortably. It's very easy to stay in for an extended period of time. So I generally prefer to spend a little bit more. And in terms of where I store it, I have a barn. So I've got 29 boats up in my barn right now. Other places that you can store it are in your basement. If you've got a crawl space, my last house, I had 10 boats in my crawl space. They and the crickets were down there having a good time. The Scout units that are in my area, several of them have strong relationships with their chartered organizations. One of the local churches has some storage space. We've spoken with storage unit facilities that have been willing to donate a storage unit for a year. I think just being creative. There are a number of storage racks that can be built or purchased, so you could store 5 or 6 kayaks on the wall of a garage without any difficulty. One of the things that I find is a huge advantage for paddlecraft versus powerboats or sailboats is that if I have enough people to go boating, let's say I've got 10 people in my ship and then 5 adults, it's 15 boats, or 15 boats, 15 people. A vessel large enough to hold 15 people is pretty difficult to store. It's expensive to store. It requires specialized facilities. If I'm using kayaks, I can store my kayak at my house and your kayak at your house, and maybe 2 or 3 boats at another person's house. It's easier to spread it out. And the maintenance on a plastic kayak is pretty much don't do anything stupid to it. Don't take a drill to it. Don't drop hot tools on it, but it's a very low maintenance thing. And I see the question about designing a trailer. So I've got a full-size pickup truck with a lumber rack on it, so I can put 11 boats onto that. You can buy a number of commercial trailers, and the other advantage, same as with storage, is that you can use multiple vehicles to bring your boats there. But there are lots of commercially designed trailers. My flotilla, not my flotilla, my ship has a trailer that'll hold 8 kayaks that was purchased from a local manufacturer.
Okay. What's your ratio of 1-person to 2-person kayaks?
I don't own any 2-person kayaks. They're all single boats. And the reason for that is, one, it's what I personally used and then what I was able to get people to donate. The other advantage is that if it's all 1-person boats, I bring 1 boat for every person. And nobody in my ship was interested in a 2-person kayak. There are a number of very high quality tandem kayaks. I've paddled them occasionally. They're a tremendous amount of fun. And one of the advantages of a 2-person kayak is that you can put a strong paddler with a new paddler, an experienced paddler, or a young paddler. So, I can take somebody who's never been on the water before and help them have a good experience. In terms of who donates kayaks, I've worked with local paddling clubs and just said, hey, if anybody is looking to get rid of a boat, if anybody has one that is near at the end of its lifespan and you're trying to sell it for $50 or $100, would you be willing to donate it? Or would you be willing to take $50 or $100 that I can afford to pay, or the ship can afford to pay? The other thing is that most manufacturers are pretty open to reduced prices on boats. So at one point, Sea Scouts had pro deals with Jackson Kayak, Dagger Kayak, Aquabound Paddles, Werner Paddles, and a couple Bellyac, a couple other groups. The COVID pandemic has impacted manufacturing, and I'm not sure that how many of those deals are still available, but talking to manufacturers and liveries is a good way to deal with that. And yes, we definitely find that dealers will discount their boats at the end of the season up until this year. The pandemic has completely changed the supply chain for boating. I was told by a sales rep for a paddle company that they had completely sold out all the paddles they were going to manufacture a year in advance. So those discounts are less available now. I suspect that as people kind of get back to normal, we'll find that those discounts come back, though. And then the other thing, that the Nantahala Outdoor Center is a local large paddling school near me. They always, at the end of the season, sell off a large part of their flotilla. So that is a way to get involved with it or get boats. Talk to rental fleets and see what you can get. Generally, those boats are in pretty good condition. And you're welcome.
Yeah. Well, Robin, I think that's great. The last comment, great presentation. Thank you. I think speaks for all of us. We're really lucky to have you with us tonight, and expertly handling the full gamut of paddlecraft questions. So we all really appreciate your expertise and sharing your time with us tonight. Hopefully
it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hopefully you'll join us for another AuxScout webinar in the future, where we can maybe concentrate on, another advanced paddlecraft topic.
I would love to do that.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for logging on tonight. And I do want to remind you, this webinar is recorded and will be posted to the AuxScout YouTube channel, where it can be used for training with your Sea Scout ship or your flotilla. So please pass the word. And I hope that you'll join us for our next AuxScout webinar. Thank you again, Robin, and everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.